The wind came down from the red mesas like a slow breath from something old and dying. It swept through the valley, stirring the dust and the bones of sagebrush, and laid its dry hand across her face. Her lips cracked beneath it. Her eyes burned. She kept walking. Mara's boots had long since split at the seams. The leather flapped against her ankles like loose skin. Blood had dried on her heel, and each step felt like a blade dragging across her flesh. Still, she walked. The desert had stripped everything from her horse, her water, her faith, but it had not yet taken her will. Not yet. The sun pressed its weight upon her shoulders. It did not burn. It crushed. The horizon wavered like a lie, and far off she thought she saw the shimmer of water. She knew better. Mirage or mercy, it would vanish the moment she blinked. She staggered, caught herself on her hands, the heat biting her palms. When she looked down, the earth seemed alive, ants crawling over the bones of a jackrabbit, its skull grinning up through dust. She wondered if that was what she looked like to the sky, another creature crawling, dying, nameless. She did not pray. There was no one left to listen. The memory came unbidden, as all cruel ones do. Smoke. The sound of hooves pounding through her village like thunder. Her mother's voice screaming her name through the haze. The faces of men, white, sunburned, hard, the flash of rifles. She remembered the smell of burnt cottonwood and the feel of her sister's hand slipping from hers. That was the last time she had run for her life. Now she walked toward its end. By the time the sun began to sink, her vision blurred. The land turned copper and purple, the rocks long shadows reaching like fingers toward her. She dropped to her knees. Her throat was a wound of dust. Her breath came in gasps that tore through her ribs. A horse's neigh broke through the wind. At first, she thought it was a dream, a sound born from the mind's last cruelty. But then came the jingle of tack, the creak of saddle leather. She lifted her head. A man was riding toward her from the west, where the sun burned low. He was a dark silhouette against the light, hat brimmed down, rifle slung over his shoulder. Mara tried to rise. The ground refused her. When the rider reached her, he dismounted with slow, deliberate motion. His boots were worn, his spurs dulled, his coat thick with dust. He crouched beside her, the smell of sweat and horse filling the air. His face was shadowed, but his voice was rough and human. "Can you hear me?" Her tongue was too swollen to answer. He unslung a canteen, pressed it against her lips. The first drop of water was pain, sharp as fire, but she swallowed greedily. It spilled down her chin, cooling the cracked earth of her skin. "Easy now," he said, tilting it back. "You'll choke." She looked at him through the haze. His eyes were pale gray, maybe blue. She could not tell. There was a scar cutting through one eyebrow. She thought he might be young, though his face was already carved with years of sun and grit. "Apache?" he asked quietly. She did not nod. She did not need to. Her hair, her dress, her silence said enough. He sighed, glancing toward the horizon as if the land itself might disapprove. "All right," he muttered. "Let's get you out of here." He lifted her in his arms. She was too weak to resist. Her head fell against his chest, and she could hear the steady drum of his heart beneath the dust and fabric. It sounded impossibly alive. The horse snorted as he placed her across the saddle, then swung up behind her. The world swayed. She clung to the horn out of instinct. They rode in silence through the bleeding light. The wind grew cooler, carrying the faint smell of rain that would never come. Mara felt herself slipping in and out of consciousness, her mind wandering to things half remembered, the laughter of her sister, the color of the river before the raid, the taste of roasted corn. Once, she woke to find his hand steadying her. His thumb brushed the back of her arm, not tenderly, but to make sure she still lived. They reached a small cabin as night took the valley, a crooked thing made of rough pine, with smoke trickling from a tin pipe. The horse halted, and he slid down, catching her before she fell. Inside, it smelled of tobacco, coffee, and loneliness. He laid her on a narrow bed. "You're safe here," he said, though his voice held doubt, as if he knew safety was a fragile thing in that land. She tried to speak, but her throat gave only a whisper. "Why?" He looked at her then, really looked at the face of a woman who should have died in the dust, and at the blood on his own hands that had put her kind in the ground. Because, he said, after a long while, someone ought to. Outside, the wind shifted. Coyotes called in the distance, lonely and unashamed. Mara closed her eyes, not from trust, but from exhaustion. The sound of his boots moving across the floor was the last thing she heard before darkness came again, deep and merciful. The night was long and without stars. The roof creaked under the push of the wind, and somewhere beyond the walls, a coyote yipped, its voice fading into the black. Inside, the dim flame of a single lantern cast its trembling light across the room. Rough planks, a tin pot, a rifle resting by the door. Mara woke to the smell of smoke and meat. Her mouth was dry again, but not like before. The air here held life, faint though it was. She tried to sit, and pain shot through her ribs. The blanket slipped from her shoulders, revealing the bruises that bloomed like dark flowers across her skin. The cowboy, she did not yet know his name, sat by the fire, turning a strip of venison over a skillet. His hands were steady, brown from years of sun. He had taken off his hat, and his hair was the color of rusted wire. When he noticed her awake, he nodded, neither warm nor cold. "You're tougher than most," he said. "Didn't think you'd see morning." She blinked, her voice scraping out like gravel. "Why help me?" He shrugged, poured coffee into a tin cup. "Guess I got tired of burying people." He brought her a small piece of meat and half a biscuit, hard as stone. She ate slowly, her hands trembling. The food was coarse, but each bite dragged her a little further from the edge of death. When she finished, he took the plate without a word. He moved with the quiet assurance of a man who had spent too long alone, each gesture deliberate, like he had learned the cost of waste. "I'll fetch some water later," he said. "Creek's down past the cottonwoods. You'll rest a day or two, then I'll see you north. Fort's that way. Safer for you." She looked toward the small window, where dawn's first gray was crawling across the sky. "Fort? It's where the soldiers keep order." His voice faltered for a moment, then steadied. "Better than dying out here." Her gaze hardened. "Soldiers killed my people." He paused, hand resting on the table. The wind pressed against the door, whistling through the cracks. "I know," he said finally. For a while, they said nothing more. The day came slowly, filling the cabin with pale light. She watched him through the stillness, the way he checked his rifle, the way he knelt to pack his saddlebag, the care he gave to small things. He wasn't cruel, but cruelty, she thought, was not always a thing done with hate. Sometimes it was the shape a life took when it forgot how to feel. Later, when he stepped outside, she rose on unsteady legs and followed. The cold air cut her throat, sharp and clean. Beyond the cabin, the land opened wide, a great stretch of ochre hills and pale grasses waving like smoke. To the west, the mountains loomed, snow clinging to their high crowns. He stood by the horse, tightening the girth. When he saw her, he frowned. "You ought to rest." "I've rested enough." Her voice was steadier now. He studied her for a long moment, then handed her a small pail. "If you're set on moving, come along then. Water's not far." The walk to the creek was quiet except for the crunch of dry earth beneath their boots. The sun climbed behind them, warming the frost from the grass. When they reached the water, she knelt and cupped it into her hands. It was clear, cold as bone. He filled his canteen and crouched beside her. "Name's Cade," he said. She did not answer. He glanced at her. "You got one?" "Mara." He nodded once. "Mara." The word came awkwardly from his mouth, like it belonged to a different tongue. "You from the Chiricahua?" She dipped her fingers into the current, watching the ripples fan outward. "I was." He said nothing more, and she did not ask what he meant by "was." On the way back, he spoke once, almost to himself. "World's turned upside down out here. No one knows who's the outlaw anymore." She looked at him. "You think yourself a good man?" He gave a low, humorless laugh. "No, ma'am. I think I'm still breathing. That's all." They reached the cabin again as noon rose white and heavy. He busied himself with his tools, oiling a worn revolver, mending a bridle strap. Mara watched, memorizing the rhythm of his hands, the rough competence of a man who had built his own cage and learned to live inside it. When evening came, she stepped outside alone. The wind had calmed, and the first stars appeared above the mesas. The air smelled faintly of pine and iron. For the first time in years, she felt something close to quiet, though she could not name it peace. Behind her, Cade leaned in the doorway, arms crossed. "You'll head north when you're ready," he said softly. "Or stay till you decide where the hell to go next. Makes no difference to me." But the way his eyes lingered said otherwise. Mara turned her gaze to the far ridges where the sky still burned faintly pink. "It makes a difference," she said, more to herself than to him. And though neither of them spoke again that night, a fragile thread thin as smoke had begun to form between them, unseen yet undeniable. Days folded over one another like worn blankets, thin but warming. In the morning she rose before him and stepped into the breathless cold, the land silvered with frost as if some slow river of moonlight had hardened across the grass. She carried wood to the stove, lit kindling with flint he left by the hearth, and learned the stubborn patience of flame. When the fire caught, the cabin filled with the soft smell of pitch and smoke, and her hands remembered other mornings, other fires, other faces gone to ash. She held the ache like a stone in her mouth and did not speak of it. He showed her where the fence had slumped, posts tilting like drunk men. She set her shoulder to the cedar rails. The splinters bit deep, and the old wires sang in a low, tired voice as they stretched it tight. Her palms split open again. She wrapped them in buckskin and kept working. The sky was high and white as bone. At noon he opened his canteen and tilted it toward her. They drank in turn without words, and she wondered if that counted as trust or only necessity. By evening she had learned the map of his little world. A salt block under the cottonwood for a pair of rangy cattle, a half-barrel for catching rain that seldom came, a row of tools hanging from pegs, their wooden handles polished by years of a single set of hands. On a shelf above the bed he kept a small book with a cracked spine, the cover worn to softness. He did not read it aloud, but sometimes at night he would hold it and look into the middle distance, as if the words were a far country only he could see. She knew prayer when she saw it, though his lips barely moved. He mended her boots with rawhide and small stitches that surprised her, given the size of his fingers. She made him new soles from a strip of old saddle skirt, and when he tried them, he pressed his heel down and said, not looking at her, that they fit like true work. The praise landed in her chest and warmed there longer than she wanted. Her body learned the place the way a hand learns a tool. She moved through sage and rabbit brush with a quiet that belonged to earlier years. She set snares by the creek while the light reddened the water and brought back a pair of desert cottontails, ears limp in her grip. He thanked her with a nod. They cooked them with a pinch of salt and a fistful of wild onion she had found in a damp seam under stone. The broth was thin but honest. He said he had not eaten this way since before the war with the men who wore blue. The word war sat heavy between them like a rock they could not walk around. At times, a thought rose in her like a hawk from scrub. She remembered her sister, the small scar under the girl's eye where a branch had caught her in childhood. The way she would sing when she ground corn, a song older than rivers. In the quiet parts of afternoon, while Cade planed a board or patched the roof, Mara let that song hum under her breath. He did not ask its meaning. He only listened with his head cocked a little, as if a wind had shifted, carrying a story not meant for him. Under a bedroll at the foot of the bed, she discovered a tin of seeds wrapped in an oilcloth, each kernel as pale as a tooth. "Peach," he said when he noticed her looking. From a tree his mother had loved back east where rain fell in friendly ways, and the ground gave if you asked it right. He had brought the seeds across a continent, and none had lived. He said it without sorrow, like a man inventorying stones. Still he kept them. When he spoke of the tree, his voice went soft at the edges. On the fourth morning after she first stood without swaying, he saddled the horse and handed her the reins. "If you aim to go north, you can practice now," he said. She set her foot in the stirrup and swung up. The animal's heat rose through her legs. The leather creaked a memory of other horses, other routes. He walked beside her while she guided the gelding in a slow circle around the yard. He corrected her hands with a touch that barely met her skin. She watched the blunt care of his movements, the dogged gravity of a man who had decided that not harming was a kind of work. He began to learn her words. "Water," he said, pointing to the creek. She nodded, He tried again, shaping the syllables with comic care until both of them smiled without meaning to. She asked him the word for cloud, and he said it in his own tongue first, then in hers, his accent rounding the sound into something new. In the evenings, they traded names for simple things: fire, bread, horse. The learning built a bridge made of everyday planks. It held. One night, a low hum reached them from far down the valley, not quite thunder, not quite wind. He stepped to the doorway and stood listening, shoulders rigid. She joined him, feeling the sound in her ribs more than in her ears. "Riders," he said at last, "more than a few." The wind carried a thread of tobacco and sweat and iron. He doused the lamp, and the room fell to a soft dark that smelled of cold ash. Through the open door the night showed a scatter of stars, sharp as flint. He went to the shelf and took down his rifle, ran a cloth along the barrel. Habit, not threat. He said that a new foreman had taken charge at the big spread north of the mesa, a man who liked to run all things like cattle, people included. The name hung unspoken, but the fear around it had the plain weight of fact. He had worked there once. He had left in anger that cost him a friend. He said no more, yet a story walked between his words like a shadow of a man. In the quiet that followed, she asked, "You saved me for a debt." He flinched a little and admitted he had scouted for soldiers when he was young and hungry, and thought survival meant saying yes. What he had seen in that uniform would not leave him, and sometimes he woke with his teeth clenched hard enough to ache. The hum in the distance swelled, then faded. The riders veered south, or simply dissolved into the night. He eased the hammer down and set the rifle by the door again. Silence came back like a tide. He looked at her and said, "I will see you north if you wish." She answered that the road north could wait a day longer. Something in both of them had chosen to hold. The morning after the riders passed, the air smelled of cold ash and sage. Cade stepped outside to check for tracks, his rifle resting easy in the crook of his arm. Mara followed him to the edge of the creek, her shawl drawn close around her shoulders. The water murmured softly between stones, as if the land itself was trying to speak in its sleep. "They didn't stop," he said, crouching to touch a hoofprint. "Headed east." "Who are they?" she asked. "Men I used to ride with," he said. "Before I learned what they were." He didn't look at her as he said it, and she didn't ask more. The truth in his voice was enough. They walked back to the cabin in silence. The sun was only a pale coin behind thin clouds, casting no warmth. He fed the fire while she ground corn in a wooden bowl he'd carved years ago. The sound of the pestle was rhythmic, steady like the heart of the house itself. He watched her work from his chair, elbows on his knees. "You ever think of leaving this country?" he asked after a while. Mara kept her eyes on the bowl. "Every day." "What stops you?" She lifted her gaze, and for a long time she didn't speak. When she did, her voice was low. "The land remembers." He nodded slowly, though he couldn't claim to understand. The wind scraped against the shutters, filling the silence between them. Later that day they rode together into the valley to check the traps. Snow had fallen on the high ridges during the night, dusting the red rock with white. The air carried the metallic scent of winter's approach. She rode ahead, the horse moving sure beneath her. Cade followed a few paces behind, watching the way her braid swung against her back, the way she looked at the land as if it were kin. At the second trap, they found a coyote caught by the leg. It thrashed weakly, eyes wild with pain. Cade moved to raise his rifle, but Mara stopped him with a hand on his arm. "No," she said softly. He hesitated. "It's suffering. Then we end it right." She knelt by the animal, whispering something he didn't understand, a prayer, or perhaps an apology. Her knife was quick, clean. The coyote went still. She wiped the blade on her skirt and stood, her face unreadable. Cade looked at her for a long time before speaking. "You've seen more mercy than most preachers." "Mercy is not a sermon," she said. They rode home without words, but something in him had shifted. That night, he dreamed of faces he hadn't seen in years: the boy he'd shot in a canyon fight, the woman who had begged him for water and whom he'd ridden past. When he woke, the stars were fading, and the faint warmth of dawn pressed against the window. He found her outside, sitting by the fire pit, eyes turned east. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked. She shook her head. "Dreams don't end when you wake." He sat beside her, close enough to feel the heat from her shoulder. "You think they ever do?" "No," she said, "but maybe they change shape." For the first time he reached out not to comfort, but to understand. His hand brushed hers. She didn't pull away. The days that followed settled into a strange, quiet rhythm. They worked side by side, splitting wood, repairing the roof, salting meat for winter. Sometimes, when the wind softened, he would tell her small pieces of his story. A boyhood on the plains, a father who had died in a flood, a dream of owning land that wasn't borrowed from someone else's sorrow. She listened, not as one listening for confession, but as one who recognized the shape of loneliness. One evening, while the fire burned low, she told him of her sister, the one who'd sung to the corn, the one she couldn't save. Cade listened, eyes fixed on the flames. When she fell silent, he said only, "I'm sorry." The simplicity of it broke something open in her. No man had ever said those words to her before. That night, when he turned to lay another log on the fire, she spoke his name for the first time, not as a question, but as a tether. "Cade." He turned. She looked at him through the dim light, her face calm but her voice trembling. "You saved me, but I don't think you know what that means." He took a slow breath. "Maybe I'm still learning." Outside, the wind shifted. The coyotes were silent. He reached for her then, not out of desire but recognition, a shared hunger for something neither of them had words for. His hand found the back of her neck, and she let him. The fire cracked, throwing sparks into the air. They stayed like that for a long time, two people carved by loss, finding the faintest warmth in each other's shadow. When he finally spoke, it was barely more than a whisper. "If those men come back, they won't take you. Not while I'm standing." Her eyes glinted in the firelight. "Then we stand together." And though the night was cold, neither reached for another blanket. The storm arrived 3 days later, rolling down from the northern ridges like a beast made of dust and snow. The wind came first long, low, and endless. It howled through the canyon, bending the cottonwoods and shaking the roof until the timbers groaned. Cade and Mara worked through the dusk, dragging wood inside, lashing the shutters closed. The air turned white, and soon they could not see beyond the doorway. By nightfall, the world was erased. Inside, the cabin was dim and close, the lantern's glow soft as breath. The wind pressed against the walls, and every crack hissed with cold. Cade sat sharpening his knife, though there was nothing to cut. Mara mended a torn sleeve by the hearth, her fingers moving with quiet focus. Each stitch was a heartbeat, steady and human, against the storm's blind roar. "You've seen weather like this before?" he asked. She nodded. "Once. The year my father died." He looked up. "Cold take him?" "No," she said, tying off the thread. "Men did." Cade set down the knife. The silence that followed was heavier than thunder. "After a while," she said, "we buried him in frozen ground. My mother said the earth would keep him safe until it thawed." He ran a hand across his jaw, rough with days of stubble. "You talk about it like it still matters." "It does," she said simply. "The dead don't leave. They just wait for us to listen." He nodded, staring into the fire. "Then I reckon I've got a whole camp of them hollerin' at me." Her eyes softened, but she said nothing. The storm raged through the night. When the wind struck the door, Mara reached instinctively for the rifle. Cade touched her wrist. "Ain't no men out there tonight," he said. "Even devils would freeze." She relaxed slowly, though her heart still beat fast. The sound of his voice, low, steady, certain, worked its way into the silence like a promise he didn't know he'd made. When dawn came, the snow had drifted high against the door. Cade shouldered it open with a grunt, and the cold burst in, clean and brutal. The valley lay buried in white. Even the fences were gone, swallowed whole. Mara stepped outside and looked toward the horizon. The sun was rising behind the storm's tail, a pale coin pressed into a sky of pewter. She could see no tracks, no sign of life except their own. For a strange moment, it felt like the whole world had ended and begun again. He joined her on the threshold, breath fogging in the air. "You ever think the land's trying to wash us away?" he asked. "It's not the land," she said. "It's the ones who forget to listen to it." He smiled faintly, though his eyes were tired. "Guess I've been guilty of that." They spent the day clearing paths and shaking snow from the roof. The work warmed them more than the fire ever could. When the sun dipped, Cade brought in the last armload of wood, his coat stiff with frost. Mara had made a stew from dried venison and a handful of roots she'd saved. The smell filled the room, rich and sharp. When they sat to eat, she asked, "You said those riders were men you used to ride with. What did you mean?" He stared into his bowl. "We took jobs, escorting cattle, guarding freight, sometimes tracking runaways." She set her spoon down. "Runaways?" His jaw tightened. "Families trying to get back to their people. I didn't ask who. Should've." The fire cracked between them. For a long while, neither spoke. Then Mara said, "And when you found them?" He met her eyes. "We brought them back. I was young, broke, and dumb enough to believe there was law in it. Didn't see what I'd become till too late." Outside, the wind began to rise again, but softer now, like breath instead of rage. "You can't bury a thing by pretending it never happened," she said quietly. "I know," he said, "but I've tried." She looked at him, and in her gaze there was no forgiveness, only understanding. "Then, stop trying." He laughed once low, broken. "You make it sound easy. It isn't, but it's the only way the dead stop shouting." Later, when the fire burned low, he reached into his coat and pulled out something wrapped in cloth. He handed it to her. Inside was a silver medallion, tarnished and bent. The engraving had worn away, but she could still make out part of an emblem, 2 wings, a sword. "I took it off a man I shouldn't have killed," Cade said. "Kept it as a reminder." She turned it over in her palm. "And what does it remind you?" "That sometimes living's the harder sin." She looked at him, then really looked. The lines around his mouth, the scar near his eye, the hands roughened by work and regret. "You saved me," she said. "Maybe that's the beginning." He held her gaze a long time. Or the reckoning. The wind quieted at last. The cabin felt smaller in the silence that followed, yet warmer too. Outside, snow fell soft and slow, erasing all tracks, leaving only the small glow of their fire in a white and endless world. They sat together till sleep found them both, the medallion resting between them on the table like a shared secret, glinting faintly in the firelight. The thaw came slow, creeping down from the mountains in hesitant breaths. The snow softened first along the creek, where water ran beneath a thin skin of ice, whispering secrets to the stones. Then the ground began to show itself again, dark, wet earth breathing through the white. By the time the first blades of grass appeared, the silence had changed. The land was waking. Cade leaned on the fence post, watching the melt gather into small rivulets that cut through the mud. Mara was kneeling a few yards away, turning the soil with a broken-handled hoe. Her hands were cracked, her hair tangled, and yet there was something sacred in the motion, the way she pressed each seed into the dirt with care, as though she were asking forgiveness from the earth itself. He wiped his brow and said, "Didn't figure you for the farming kind." She looked up, squinting against the sunlight. "Where I come from, planting is remembering." He nodded. "And harvesting?" "Thanking." The air hung quiet between them. A crow passed overhead, its cry harsh but alive. Cade found he couldn't look away from her, not for her beauty, though it was there in the fierce plainness of her, but for the way she moved like the land itself had claimed her. That night, he brought the small tin of peach seeds down from the shelf. They sat by the fire, the wind humming softly at the door. He poured the seeds into her palm. "Think any of these might grow here?" She studied them under the flickering light. "If they remember where they came from," he smiled faintly, "then maybe they got a chance." They planted them the next morning, behind the cabin where the soil was softest. She whispered something in her own tongue as they worked, a rhythm that rose and fell with the wind. Cade didn't ask the meaning. He didn't need to. He could feel it in the way she pressed her fingers into the ground, gentle and sure. When the last seed was buried, she brushed the dirt from her hands and looked at him. "Now we wait." He glanced toward the mountains, still streaked with snow. "Never been good at waiting." "Then this will teach you." He laughed quietly, and for a moment it felt almost easy between them, like the storm and the riders and the ghosts of the past were far behind. But the land had a way of keeping score. 2 weeks later, a rider appeared on the horizon. Cade saw him first, a dark speck moving fast along the ridge. He stepped onto the porch, rifle in hand, and watched until the horse slowed near the fence. The man who dismounted was lean and dusty, his face half hidden beneath a hat pulled low. When he spoke, his voice carried the rough twang of old acquaintance. "Hell, Cade. Didn't think you'd still be breathing." Cade's grip tightened on the rifle. "Depends who's asking." The man smiled, though there was no warmth in it. "Name's Boyd. You remember. Used to ride with me before you found your conscience." Mara had come to the doorway, silent as shadow. Cade didn't look at her. "What do you want, Boyd?" "Word is there's bounty out for an Apache woman seen heading north. Thought maybe you'd taken a shine to saving strays again." He spat in the dirt. "Colonel wants her alive, though I don't reckon he'll mind otherwise." Cade said nothing. The wind stirred the silence between them. Boyd's eyes flicked toward Mara, standing half in light, half in shade. "Well, I'll be damned," he said softly. "You always did pick the hard roads." Cade lifted the rifle a fraction. "You'd best ride on." Boyd chuckled. "Can't do that. Not without my payday." For a long moment, no one moved. Then Cade said, "You'll have to earn it." The shot came fast, echoing off the ridge. Boyd stumbled back, clutching his arm, cursing. Cade's rifle smoked, steady in his hands. "You son of a—" Boyd's words broke into a snarl. He swung into the saddle armed and spurred his horse hard, disappearing into the dust. When the sound of hooves faded, Cade turned toward the cabin. Mara stood rigid, eyes burning. "You should have killed him," she said. He shook his head. "That kind of killing never stays buried." Her jaw tightened. "Neither does mercy." He didn't argue. He knew she was right in ways that cut deeper than pride. That night, the valley was still. The stars burned bright and indifferent. They sat by the dying fire, the rifle between them, the silence heavy with what could not be undone. "He'll be back," she said finally. "I know, and others, probably." She turned to him. "Then we don't wait for them." Cade looked at her, this woman who had lost everything and still spoke of tomorrow as if it could be built. "Where would we go?" "Anywhere the land forgets our names." He thought of the peach seeds buried behind the cabin, sleeping in the cold earth, waiting for spring. "Maybe we give it a few days," he said. "See if anything takes root." She nodded once. "Then we go." Outside, the wind shifted, carrying the faint scent of rain. He reached across the table and took her hand. Her fingers were warm, steady, alive. For the first time in years, Cade felt something move in him that wasn't regret. It was small, uncertain, but real, like a seed under frost, waiting for the thaw. The rain came before dawn, soft as breath at first, then stronger, until it drummed against the roof in a steady, forgiving rhythm. Cade woke to its sound and to the weight of her beside him. The cabin smelled of wet wood and smoke, the air warm where their bodies met beneath the blanket. For a moment, he stayed still, eyes open to the pale light filtering through the cracks in the shutter, listening to the world exhale. Mara stirred, her hair damp against his shoulder. "It's raining," she murmured, half in wonder. "Hasn't in months," he said. She rose and went to the door barefoot. When she pushed it open, the wind swept in, cool and smelling of sage and new earth. The yard was dark with mud, the peach plot slick and shining. She stepped out into it, letting the rain soak her skirt, her arms, her face. Cade watched from the doorway. She stood there, eyes closed, and for an instant she looked like something the desert itself had dreamed back to life. He joined her, boots sinking into the soft ground. "You'll catch cold." "I've been colder," she said. He almost smiled. The water ran down his hat brim and over his face, washing the grit from his beard. Together they turned toward the garden. The seeds lay hidden under the thin crust of earth, and though there was no sign of green yet, the ground seemed alive again, breathing with promise. When the rain eased, they built a small fire outside, more for comfort than warmth. Steam rose from their clothes, twisting in the morning light. He brewed coffee from the last of his grounds. They drank in silence, each thinking of the road ahead, the miles of empty country, the men who might be following, the uncertain mercy of the frontier. After a while, he said, "When this ends, if it ever does, what will you do?" She watched the creek, now swollen and restless. "Find a place where no one asks what I was before." He nodded. "Sounds like peace." "It's not peace I want," she said quietly. "It's belonging." The word hung in the air, and he felt it land deep inside him. "Maybe they're the same thing," he said, but she only shook her head. By noon, the rain had stopped. The sun broke through, glinting off wet stone, turning the valley gold. Cade packed the saddlebags with jerky, ammunition, and a blanket. She rolled the last of the dried cornmeal into cloth and tied it shut. Neither spoke much as they worked. Departure hung in the air like a held breath. He paused at the peach plot, crouched low. The soil was soft beneath his hand. He brushed it gently, almost not believing his eyes. "Look," he said. She came beside him. A single shoot, thin and green, had pushed through the dark earth. It trembled in the breeze, fragile as a whisper but alive. Her lips parted, and something unspoken passed between them, hope, disbelief, maybe both. "Guess it remembered," he said. She knelt, touched the sprout with one finger. "Then so must we." They saddled the horse together, moving without hurry. The sky stretched wide and clean above them, the air smelling of rain and rebirth. Before mounting, Cade turned back toward the cabin. The smoke from their last fire drifted lazily upward, a single thread against the blue. "You sure you want to leave it?" he asked. She looked at the cabin, at the field, at the small green thing in the soil. "It'll grow without us," she said. "That's the way of things." He gave a slow nod. "And us?" She met his gaze. "We'll see." They rode out as the sun lowered behind the mesas, casting long shadows that stretched like memories across the ground. The world ahead was vast, uncertain, beautiful in its emptiness. Mara leaned slightly forward in the saddle, the wind lifting strands of her hair. Cade kept pace beside her, his hand brushing hers on the reins now and then, a quiet promise in the touch. Behind them, the valley faded into distance. The cabin shrank to a speck. The young tree, unseen, swayed in the wind that carried their names away. They did not speak of love, not aloud. The word was too small for what lived between them now, a shared defiance against all that had broken them, and all that might still come. As the sky deepened into evening, Mara turned to him and said, "Do you think the land forgets?" He smiled faintly, eyes on the far horizon. "Maybe it forgives instead." The wind swept their laughter eastward, carrying it over the grasslands, through the canyons, toward places neither had yet seen. Somewhere behind them, in a patch of wet soil, a seedling reached toward the sun, and for the first time in a long, long while, both of them believed that something good might grow again.